Welcome to Have Toga Will Travel, a podcast exploring the Mediterranean world, ancient and modern, through the eyes of two former classics professors. I'm Emily.
I'm Cam.
And we're your hosts.
In our last episode, we talked about the monuments on the Acropolis as we see them today, and the circumstances of their creation in the 5th century BCE.
And we would encourage you to go check out our blog on our website where we put up some pictures of the Nashville recreation statue of Athena for you, those of you who might be interested in seeing what the statue could have looked like. We encourage you to go over there and check it out.
Don't judge us on the quality of the photographs. We took those years ago with a very old portable camera.
Yes.
But they give you a pretty good impression of what that statue looks like.
Yeah, they do.
Anyway, today what we're going to do is dive into the history of the Acropolis both before and after the 5th century BCE.
The Acropolis actually has a really long, fascinating history, in addition to the stunning buildings from the 5th century that we see today. Now, this history is a little hard to get a sense of when you visit the site, partly because it isn't necessarily obvious or explained much to the visitor today. And throughout this long history, one of the things that has remained constant really until the last couple centuries is the Acropolis has been a place of military defense, right? It's fortified and it served as the citadel for the city. I mean, that's actually what Acropolis generally means in Greek. It means the high city, and that is the part that is fortified and is sort of the last place of retreat within the city. But other than that, the activities that have happened within the walls of the Acropolis have changed over time. Often there has been an emphasis on the sacred in multiple different religions, but that's not been the limit of what has happened up there. And of course, more recently, in the last couple centuries, there's been an emphasis on continuity with the ancient past and antiquity.
Right, and what we're going to do is walk you through how this has worked in different historical periods, starting with the Bronze Age and then looking at more recent periods of history.
Yeah, so everything but the 5th century stuff we talked about last time.
Everything but the 5th century, yes. So let's start by talking a little bit about the Bronze Age. Specifically, what we're talking about here is the late Bronze Age, roughly a period between 1500 and 1200 BCE. On the Greek mainland in general, this is a period in which we see the emergence of some fairly large fortified palaces all over the place. And these palaces, we think, functioned as basically the center of highly organized kingdoms that were based on raking in tribute and redistributing the wealth to supporters of the regime.
So the most famous of these palaces on the mainland are in Mycenae. And of course, then also on the island of Crete, you had these palaces as well, the most famous one there being at Knossos. But they actually existed in most major cities in the Aegean, including Athens. And in Athens, the palace, or the term for it in Greek is megaron, was built in the late Bronze Age, and then not long after, a fortification wall is built on the Acropolis. And this fortification wall was made of what we call Cyclopean masonry. Now, Cyclopean masonry consists of massive, seemingly irregular-shaped rocks, usually made of limestone, tightly fitted together. And they get called Cyclopean because of later ideas that these rocks were so massive that they must have been built by the Cyclopes. Now, these Cyclopes are, mythologically speaking, the sons of Uranus and Gaia. They are master craftsmen. They are the makers of Zeus's thunderbolt. And they are different from the Cyclopses that show up in, say, the Odyssey, like Polyphemus. Those are different Cyclopses. And this wall of Cyclopean masonry remains the main fortification wall until sometime in the 5th century. And the primary entrance, the primary gate to the citadel, would have been on the southwest side of the Acropolis.
And for really good examples of Cyclopean masonry today, you can go visit either Mycenae or Tiryns, both of which are in the Peloponnese in Greece, and both of which consist of some really spectacular circuit walls that are just built with these huge, well-fitted blocks.
Yeah.
Anyway, on the Acropolis itself, you can still see a few traces here and there of the old Bronze Age Cyclopean masonry. There's a little trace of it near the old museum building on the southeast corner of the Acropolis. But more interestingly, there is also a cutout in the bastion of the Temple of Nike, right near the entrance to the Acropolis, a cutout that was created by the ancient Athenians themselves, which allowed them to look at the old Bronze Age masonry even after it had been encased by the masonry of their new bastion.
Yeah, you walk right by it as you're going into the Propylaea.
And finally, there's a set of Bronze Age stairs near the southwest corner of the Parthenon. The Parthenon occupies part of the Acropolis that had been really incredibly built up. And basically, they had to fill in an area that prior to the construction of the Parthenon was outside of the old Bronze Age walls. So the old Bronze Age walls were incorporated within that filled area.
Yeah. And we have pictures of these, not great pictures of these, but we'll put them up on our blog. And there's a funny story about the stairs when we were getting the pictures there, because for years we had gone and hadn't realized that in this sort of open hole functionally next to the Parthenon.
A work of modern excavation, we should stress.
Yeah. That you could see these Bronze Age stairs until we'd read about it somewhere. And so the next time we went to the Acropolis, we were very excited to find them and see them. And we did, and we were very excited, and we were taking pictures and like having a real moment. And then other tourists saw us being very excited. So they came over like, oh, there's something cool there. And then they kind of all just stood there and like looked at it and like could not figure out what we were so excited about.
Yeah, stairs aren't really cool unless you know that they're from, 1300 BC or something like that.
Yeah. Now, the Bronze Age ends around 1200 BCE in what is often called the Bronze Age collapse. There seems to be some sort of major disruption in life all around the Aegean and somewhat beyond. We don't really know what the cause was. It's probably a combination of several complex factors, including but not limited to climate change, invasion, a breakdown of trade routes, things like that. And what functionally happens is that these palace economies collapse, and the palaces themselves are abandoned. And then over time, what we see in locations that had been Bronze Age palaces, they actually, over the centuries, then become religious sites. So they're no longer administrative centers, they become religious centers.
Yeah, and here it's worth thinking back to an observation we made when we were talking about the Colosseum. The Colosseum outlived the moment of its construction by a really long time, and people in the medieval period weren't necessarily entirely sure what they were looking at. They realized it was impressive, right? The work of important people in the past. And something similar seems to happen with these old Bronze Age palace complexes, which increasingly become imbued with religious or mythological importance.
So at some time during the Archaic period, so starting, around 700 BCE, we start getting the first temples being built on the Acropolis. And so this clearly marks, right, that the shift has happened from the administrative center of the Bronze Age to now, 500 years later, a religious center. Now, what's going on the Acropolis in the Archaic period is really, really messy and hard to understand. We're going to do our best to try to kind of distill what's happening there.
If such a thing is even possible.
Yes, but nonetheless, we do know that temples are now being built in the 7th century, and it's a sign that now, we have sacred space now.
Yeah, once again, it's hard to know exactly what was up there. The written sources believed that there were temples up there in the 7th century. Archaeologically, we don't have much evidence for those. What we do have are some foundations that date from the 6th century from a fairly monumental temple.
And you can see those today. They're right next to the Erechtheion. And I think we mentioned them last time. It's really easy to walk by and not even know what they are.
Yeah, the so-called Dorfeld foundations. The date of these foundations is disputed. Most people these days think they date from probably about 570 BCE, although there are people who argue that they're much later than that they were put up near the end of the 6th century. We also have architectural components, pediment sculptures, blocks, and things like this from at least 2 temples, possibly more.
You can see actually the remains of these pediments in the new Acropolis Museum.
Right. The first one is the so-called Bluebeard Temple. It's called that because one of the figures in the pediment sculptures is this weird 3-headed Triton creature, which had a painted blue beard on it. That's the older of the 2 temples that we can identify based on their architectural remains, probably early to mid 6th century, roughly the same date maybe as the foundations, if you lean towards the earlier side of that particular argument. The other big temple is the so-called Gigantomachy temple. And we think we have fragments of both pediments. One is the pediment group that the temple gets its name from. It depicted a gigantomachy, a struggle between the Greek gods and the giants. And there's a really well-preserved Athena figure from that pediment. The other side seems to have featured a couple of lions tearing apart a bull, which is very interesting in and of itself to look at.
Yeah.
The date of these pediment groups is really disputed. It used to be thought that they dated from about 525, but now some people are pushing that date down right to 500.
Yeah. It's a mess.
It's a mess. Like, tellingly, we don't know if either of the temples that we recognize from their pediment sculptures actually stood on the door foundations. Some people say the older one did. Some people say the newer one did. Some people say they both did. So it really is kind of a mess. And then there are a bunch of other buildings up there that we can identify either by traces on the Acropolis itself or from sculptural fragments, and we just don't know what they were.
So in the Archaic period, we have at least 2 temples on the Acropolis, but we don't really know where they were, when they were built. If there were actually 2, maybe there were 3, but we just don't know.
Yeah, and it's all very frustrating because the 6th century was a dynamic century at Athens. You had the emergence of the so-called Pisistratid tyrants. Then later on in the century, you had the collapse of their regime and the rise of democracy. And any of these people would have been interested in building temples that communicated ideas about their power and status. And we'd love to know those stories, but it's hard to construct them if we don't know from where these temples originate and when they were built.
To make things even more complicated, there's an argument that there was, in the Archaic period, a temple under where the Parthenon is now, but that no traces of it remain.
Yeah, the problem there is that we know that there was a temple built where the Parthenon now stands in the 480s. And in the process of putting that temple up, the Athenians basically dug everything down to bedrock and laid in some pretty massive foundations. So traces of anything earlier probably would have been destroyed, more or less. That temple was never finished. It was still under construction when the Persians came rampaging through in 480.
Yeah.
And it was destroyed. And then the new Parthenon was put on top of it.
Yeah. So there could have been potentially 3 temples built on that site. We know there were at least 2. And then a fun little fact about what sometimes is called the Pre-Parthenon. So the temple that was under construction when the Persians sacked Athens in 480 is that when the fortification wall gets redone in the 5th century, they actually take some of the column drums from that temple and build it into the fortification walls, where you could see it from the agora, which would have been the center of political life in Athens. So you could look up and see very clearly the remains of what the Persians had done. And they're still there today. Like, you can still see them in the wall today.
Yeah, it's a neat little touch that, again, is not necessarily obvious unless you know what you're looking for.
Yeah. Well, you'll notice them. You just won't know what they are. You can't miss them if you look up at the wall from the north side.
Fair enough.
So this is what really gets us to the 5th century and the construction we were talking about last time in the wake of the sack of the Persian Wars. But of course, the Acropolis's life goes on after the 5th century.
Yeah, so I guess we should shift to the post-classical period and talk a little bit about what was going on in Athens and on the Acropolis in subsequent centuries.
Sure. It's worth pointing out that, Athens is a political power in the 5th century, and it maintains some power after the end of the 5th century, although it does suffer great setbacks after the Peloponnesian War. But eventually Rome is going to show up and is going to conquer all of Greece. And functionally from there on out, Athens is a territory of various empires. Despite this, Athens actually manages to maintain a certain amount of cultural significance. Despite its lack of actual political power, it sort of becomes like the premier college town of the Roman Empire. And it's a place of education, of thinkers, of arts, and it still has that draw, and people are still attracted to Athens for those reasons. And so it benefits the city in terms of patronage and artistic investment in the city.
Yeah, and the Acropolis itself remained a stage where people making that kind of investment would work out their claims. So, as early as, let's say, the reign of Alexander the Great, you can see this happening. Alexander famously sent a whole bunch of spoils from his conquest of the Persian Empire to Athens, including a bunch of shields that he had riveted to the eastern facade of the Parthenon itself. And if you go and look at the eastern facade of the Parthenon, you can actually see the attachment points where those shields were hung up. Likewise, Hellenistic rulers from a kingdom based in Pergamon, in what is now Western Turkey, were great patrons of Athens during the centuries between 300 and, let's say, 100 BCE. And they funded a bunch of monuments in Athens, including a statue base that we mentioned in our last episode, which supported a big bronze chariot, a 4-horse chariot. A statue which was eventually sort of usurped by Agrippa, who used that base and that monument for his own purposes in the Augustan period.
Yeah. Augustus himself is going to go and build another temple on the Acropolis to Rome. And so, yeah, the Acropolis maintains this significance. So the travel writer Pausanias, when he's traveling around in the 2nd century, his writing indicates that the Parthenon is still seen as important, both in artistic terms, but also in historical terms. Now, that said, like all major sites, there are risks that come to these monuments from both human and natural sources. So in the case of the Acropolis and the Parthenon in particular, there's a fairly major fire in the 3rd century. It's usually attributed to the sack of Athens by the Herulians, but of course it could also have had a natural cause that we don't quite know. Remember, all right, the Colosseum had a fire due to a lightning strike. Now, after this fire, the Parthenon is never again what it was.
Yeah, it was a pretty vicious fire, which destroyed most of the interior of the main cella where the statue would have been, possibly the statue itself.
Yeah, but the Roman Emperor Julian, you might know him as Julian the Apostate, in the mid-4th century CE, does do a restoration of the Parthenon. Now, it doesn't fully restore it to what it was, but it does make it a usable temple again.
And there things stood for another few hundred years until we move into the Byzantine period. The Byzantine period really brought the first of several major changes to the Acropolis and how it functioned within the larger culture in which it was embedded. So most importantly, probably in the 6th century AD, the Parthenon was transformed from a temple dedicated to Athena into a Christian church. A church dedicated to Mary in one of her epithets, either Panagia, which means the All-Holy One, or Theotokos, specifically the Mother of God. The Erechtheion was converted into a church at this time, too. This is fortunate from our standpoint, right? A lot of these classical temples were actually taken apart. Their blocks could be reused or could be fired down in kilns in order to make lime for mortar.
As happened to parts of the Colosseum.
Right, but in this particular case, these temples were preserved as churches. And by the 12th century in particular, the former Parthenon was an Orthodox cathedral dedicated to Theotokos Atheniotissa. That is, Mary, the Mother of God, Our Lady of Athens, and the Propylaea probably was converted into the residence of the local Orthodox bishop.
Now, to transform the Parthenon into a church, and particularly into the cathedral, that does entail some transformation of the building itself. So for one thing, the entrance has to be reoriented. So an ancient temple always faced east, and the altar to the god would be outside the temple in front of the entrance, right? So the god in their statue inside their temple house, Cam is laughing at me because I'm making silly gestures right now, could look out and see the sacrifices happening outside. However, in the church, you still want the altar in the east, but the altar has been pulled into the building and enclosed. So the entrance has to be on the west side. So what happens, right, is that entrance gets reoriented. A door is cut in the west wall of the interior, and on the east wall, it's enclosed. And in this case, an apse is built, that semicircular construction where the altar would be. And in the case of the Parthenon, this actually entailed removing the central panel from the frieze that we talked about last time, which is sort of the controversial what's going on here panel. That had to be pulled out actually to make space for the apse. At the same time, in the southwest corner, a bell tower was constructed. And actually this tower is constructed with blocks taken from a monument on a nearby hill, the Philippopolis Monument.
Another interesting example of ancient monuments being recycled for new purposes, the same sort of recycling process that actually resulted in the destruction of a lot of other temples.
Yeah.
So it's in the process of this conversion from temple to church that something else fairly controversial happens. There's damage to a lot of the sculpture on the Parthenon, in particular the metopes, these square panels carved in relief that line the frieze level of the building's exterior. If you watch the video that gets displayed in the new Acropolis Museum, a video directed by
Kostagavras, a legendary Greek filmmaker from the mid to late 20th century. We'll actually put a link to it in our show notes so you can check it out.
Yeah, it's an interesting video. Among other things, it shows what looked to be a bunch of Orthodox monks defacing the sculpture on the Parthenon, and this caused a bit of a furor in Greece when the movie was released. There's no doubt that somebody went up there and damaged a bunch of the metopes. We can't pin down exactly when that happened or who did it. It's easy to imagine that at some stage in the development of Christianity, in one of its iconoclastic phases, that somebody found those metopes offensive.
And not all the metopes were defaced. They left the south side alone, which is the side depicting the fight with the centaurs.
Which is bizarre, because that's like the most obviously non-Christian of the whole batch, right?
I don't know. It's also a side that
you don't see it as often.
You don't see it as often. Anyway.
But the weird thing is the pediment sculpture was left largely alone. So even though this thing was now a church, it still carried those pediment sculptures that showed on the west the contest between Athena and Poseidon, and on the east, the birth of Athena.
But the Parthenon actually remains famous even as a church, and it becomes a site of pilgrimage in the Byzantine world from, the 8th century on through the end of the 12th century. And partly because of its patron, right, that it's dedicated to Mary, but also because it's still a really impressive building. And as we mentioned last time, even to go there today in ruins, it is awe-inspiring.
Yeah, and it would have been pretty unique in its context, right? Because there weren't many big churches like that were literally still housed in ancient buildings.
Yeah.
Our next major turning point comes in the early 13th century with the famous, or perhaps infamous, Fourth Crusade.
Yeah, those guys suck.
This is a complicated political moment. Basically, Pope Innocent III launched a crusade to recapture Jerusalem, which had been taken by earlier rounds of crusades but had once again been lost. An army consisting of a lot of so-called Franks, that is Western Europeans, and Venetians headed east to help recapture Jerusalem, but they ended up getting sucked into Byzantine internal politics on the way. Helped reinstall somebody who had been deposed. That all blew up in their faces. They didn't get paid, and they decided to sack the city of Constantinople instead. Once Byzantium, now the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. And in the wake of the sack of Constantinople, the Crusaders essentially parceled out most of the Greek world into new fiefdoms for themselves.
So Athens has now become the Duchy of Athens, and the Parthenon / the Orthodox Cathedral of Theotokos is converted into a Catholic cathedral, Notre Dame d'Athènes, or Our Lady of Athens. So it actually preserves the name that it had as a cathedral, but now it's Catholic and in French. Over the next 150 years, the city is going to change hands a lot between several different Western powers and families, including at one point a company of Catalan mercenaries. In the late 14th century, a family from Florence takes power, the Acciaiuoli family, and they actually convert the Propylaea on the Acropolis into an Italian-style palazzo complete with a tower, which gets referred to as the Frankish Tower. Again, because Frank in Greek basically means anyone from Western Europe.
That conversion of the Propylaea into an Italian-style palazzo must have been really visually striking. If you've ever seen an Italian-style palazzo, you know that they're these big, heavy, imposing buildings. And in doing this, the Acciaiuli were making a real demonstration of their own power because it would have altered the entire facade of the entrance to the Acropolis and would have marked it as the property of this noble Italian family. So it just echoes points we've made earlier about the way that the Acropolis could be used to make political statements, as well as religious ones.
Yeah.
And that carries on being true in the next phase that we're going to talk about, the Ottoman period. One of the world's great historical watersheds is the Siege of Constantinople in 1453, when the Sultan Mehmet II ended up capturing the city and really bringing an end to the Eastern Roman Empire. A few years later, Athens too also fell to the new Turkish power based in Constantinople, and Athens, along with most of the rest of the Greek world, was integrated into the growing Ottoman Empire. And at this stage, the Parthenon is transformed again, this time from Catholic cathedral into a mosque. That bell tower, built a few centuries earlier, was transformed into a minaret. There were other transformations up there too. We think that the Erechtheion basically became the harem of the Ottoman official put in charge of Athens. The Propylaea may have been his residence for a little while, that Florentine palace, although eventually a new house was built just east of what used to be the Erechtheion to house the commandant, and a whole town basically sprung up there to house the garrison.
Now, the Ottoman period is when two rather notorious episodes in the history of the Acropolis, and especially the Parthenon, take place. Now, notorious episode number 1, the explosion heard round the world. So Venice is at war with the Ottomans, and that feels like it just is a constant state of existence. Venice is just always at war with the Ottomans. But in this case, in the late 17th century, there's a war between Venice and the Ottomans, mostly over control of the Morea, that is the Peloponnese. And the Acropolis is a major Ottoman fortress. And as we mentioned, right, there's a garrison there. There is gunpowder being stored there in several places, but including the Parthenon. And the Venetian army lays siege to Athens in 1687, and in particular lays siege to the Acropolis. They have their artillery based on Philippopolis Hill, and they turn their artillery onto the Acropolis. The Parthenon is struck by a mortar shell. The gunpowder being stored there explodes, and the explosion basically blows out the center of the building. It damages much of the sculpture and the structure itself. It destroys whatever was left of the ancient interior, most of the colonnades on the long sides. Metopes, particularly on the south side, are destroyed. So there's a bit of an irony here. The metopes that had survived the earlier vandalism, that are the best preserved metopes today, come from the south side, but we're also missing the most number of metopes from the south side because they just get blown to pieces in this explosion. Now, there's a funny little footnote to this story, which is that the field commander of the Venetian army, a man by the name of Königsmark, dies a year later after the siege of the plague, which had hit the Venetian army during the occupation of Athens and killed him. And it's hard not to see this, perhaps, as the curse of the goddess coming back on them for damaging her temple.
Yeah, it's funny in sort of an ironic way, not necessarily in a ha-ha way.
I don't know. What should be the punishment for destroying a building like the Parthenon?
I mean, I really want to see the goddess at work here, because I think it makes a great story. Unfortunately, the other guy responsible for this whole mess, Morosini,
the general,
goes on to become Doge of Venice and have a spectacular career as Doge of Venice. So, maybe it doesn't work out as neatly as we want.
Oy. So at the end of this war, the Ottomans more or less leave the Parthenon in the ruined state that it was in after the explosion. But they do build a very small mosque within the ruins of the Parthenon. So you can find an image of a model of what this looked like. So you've got the Parthenon with the long sides kind of blown out, rubble in the interior, and then this tiny cute little mosque sitting inside the rubble.
And again, there things stand for a while. But the other notorious moment that happens during the Ottoman period is the moment when Lord Elgin turned his attentions to the Parthenon and ended up removing much of the sculpture that was still in place on the building. Born Thomas Bruce, he became the 7th Earl of Elgin and was appointed in 1799 as the British ambassador to the Ottoman court in Constantinople. While he was in that position, he asked for and was given permission by the Ottoman government to study the Parthenon and to take samples away, basically. This is happening in the context where there's already a mania for ancient stuff in Europe, and a lot of European intellectuals are getting really interested in ancient history and in ancient art and sculpture in particular. And it also happened in a moment where it was not easy for Westerners to gain access to the Acropolis in Athens because it was a citadel where there was an active garrison. So this is a big moment. And Elgin and his people promptly went to work inspecting things and gathering things and collecting things. Now, where things get really controversial is that there's some debate about what he was actually granted permission to do. It's not an easy question to answer because the original document that authorized him to go to the Parthenon in the first place doesn't exist anymore, and we only have an Italian translation, which may not capture the sentiment of the original entirely accurately. Clearly, Elgin thought that he had been given permission to climb up onto the Parthenon and remove sculpture that was still in place. So he and his crews pried a lot of it off, with the plan of taking it back to England.
To decorate his country home.
To decorate his country home. Now, one of the things they discovered after prying down a bunch of the statuary is that it was too heavy to transport back efficiently by ship because some of it was still anchored to big blocks that they had to remove from the temple. So there's a lot of sawing and cutting involved too. So in taking down all of this sculpture, legitimately or illegitimately, there's still a lot of dispute about this.
Yeah, I think, though, people pretty much agree that he wasn't given permission to just saw pieces off of the building.
It doesn't seem like he was. But in doing that, he does actually a lot of damage to the building.
Yeah.
He's not really alone in this. Plenty of European travelers were taking stuff home from various places in the Mediterranean, removing bits of ancient monuments and things like this. But of course, Elgin did it on a huge scale.
Yeah. And he ends up removing from the Parthenon 15 metopes, large parts of the frieze, and most of the remaining statuary from the east pediment. And in all told, he ends up removing about half of the sculpture that had survived the explosion. And this entailed not just removing things, but actually doing structural damage to the building.
Yeah, in actual fact, the Parthenon had been designed to support the weight of a lot of masonry, a lot of sculpture. And in taking off some of that sculpture and relieving the structure of some of the weight, Elgin actually made it a lot less stable than it had been. And by the time we get to the 19th century, it really was in danger of collapse, largely because of his quote-unquote interventions.
Yeah. And I'm pretty sure that also some of the sculpture that he had sent back to England by boat didn't make it because the ship sank.
Yes, there was a shipwreck.
He then has the nerve to go back and be like, I spent so much money getting this back here, but now I can't afford to keep it. So would someone please buy it off of me?
Yeah.
Which is how it ends up in the British Museum. And anyway.
Strong feelings here.
Yes.
Because in fact, all of this was controversial both at the time and now.
Yes.
The sympathetic view, this is really Elgin's own view, is that he was a patron of the arts and someone who was acting to preserve sculptures that were at risk of destruction because, of course, couldn't trust those Ottomans to take care of sculptures that had been there for hundreds of years and I guess were somehow in imminent danger of being lost or being damaged or whatever.
And they would be so much better off decorating my country home than they would be being left where they are.
Right. Listeners might be getting the sense that we don't really agree with this standpoint. And you'd be right.
Yeah.
The hostile view is that he basically plundered the Parthenon. And this was a view that could be expressed.
Which he did.
This was a view that could be expressed as early as the 19th century, almost in the moment.
Yeah.
So Lord Byron famously, within a few years, wrote a poem in which he characterized Elgin as a despoiler. And we also have some letters from British travelers who visited the Parthenon shortly after Greece gained its independence in the 1830s, who were sort of struck at how visible the damage caused by Elgin actually was. Because where he had taken stuff down, of course, you would have seen white marble, which would have contrasted very strongly with kind of the yellowish patina that characterizes the rest of the stone on the building in its weathered state.
And of course, the British Museum infamously scrubbed all the patina off of the marble that came to them from Elgin because, of course, Greek buildings should be snow white marble and shouldn't have a patina or anything on them.
And in doing so, they also destroyed a lot of trace evidence of paintwork and things like that still decorated the sculpture. Yeah.
And so the Costa Gavras video that we mentioned earlier about the history of the Parthenon, a lot of time is spent on Lord Elgin, including a recitation of the Byron poem condemning Elgin.
I forgot about that, yes.
So, it's about a 7-minute video total, and I'd say about 3 minutes of the 7 minutes are just about how terrible Elgin is.
Good times.
And so, even today, there are constant arguments about what should happen to the marbles. People get into the technicalities of the legality of what he did, like what was the scope of the firman.
The firman being the authorization document he was given by the Ottomans.
Yeah. And of course, were the Ottomans as like an outside power? Were they even legitimately able to allow him to take things? And I think the legal arguments are not worth, pursuing. And so now the argument has shifted somewhat. Every time there's a response to one of the arguments, the British Museum just changes their position. At one point, the argument was that the country of Greece had no appropriate place to display them, which was an argument put to rest when the new Acropolis Museum opened. And not only is there a place to display them, there's actually a place to display them arguably in a better context.
Oh, there's no argument about that. It's
than how they're displayed currently. And if you do go to the new Acropolis Museum, they have plaster casts of basically all the surviving bits of sculpture from the Parthenon, wherever it is. If it's not in Greece, they have plaster cast of it, but it's really easy to tell what's a plaster cast and what's not, and they will definitely tell you where the original is currently.
Yeah, the British Museum.
No, they're mostly, but not all, at the British Museum. So, once that argument went aside, now it's things like, well, these, are now important parts of British cultural history because they were so sensational when they were brought here, and, we can't part with them because they're now part of our cultural heritage. What their arguments just come down to in the end is like, we have it, you don't, nah, you can't do anything about it. I don't know. I could keep ranting on this and I won't.
A lot of the argument about Elgin these days really turns on the importance of the Parthenon sculptures as monuments that belong in Greece, right, in the context from which they originate. And in that sense, that debate kind of reflects developments after the Greek War of Independence, a war fought between 1821 and 1829 by Greeks who wanted to free Greece from Ottoman power and build a new nation state.
Which they did have support of some Western European powers in that too.
And because they had the support of Western European powers, those powers felt at liberty to intervene early on in the fate of this new nation as it was growing, and they insisted that the new nation of Greece would be governed by a king. And they went and recruited one, basically a Bavarian princeling named Otto, who became king of the Hellenes in 1831. One of the big questions in the wake of the coronation of this Bavarian princeling as king of the Greeks was what to do with the Acropolis. From early on, there were two major options. One was to transform the Acropolis into the site of a new royal palace, fit for the new kingdom.
We'd be returning to our Bronze Age roots.
Right, exactly. Or transform it into an archaeological zone. Now, interestingly enough, plans for a palace up there were actually drawn up by an architect called Friedrich Schinkel. And they're plans that you can actually look up. You'll find images of them all over the internet, and perhaps we'll link you to some of them from our webpage. It would have preserved the 5th century buildings and restored them, but would have embedded them in a new palace and its grounds. So the plan, as it was created, envisioned a modern palace on the east and south part of the Acropolis, and then palace grounds basically between the Parthenon and the Erechtheion and the Propylaea.
Now, obviously, this doesn't come to pass, and the archaeological zone instead is what's created. And they have a really explicit goal, which is to restore the Acropolis to the ancient 5th century BCE state. In particular, they want to demonstrate a link between the classical Greek past and the new Greek nation state.
Yeah, there's an argument here that this is driven mostly by the Europeans who are sort of obsessed with Greece as the wellspring of their own civilization. And there's a certain faction in the Greek government and in the Greek archaeological service that finds that convenient for their own goals, right?
So over the next decades in the 19th century, everything else that's not 5th century is basically stripped away. So the Ottoman garrison is stripped away. Any additions to the Parthenon that either for the church or the mosque were removed. So things like the tower, the bell tower / minaret, the apse, things like that. The Florentine palace and the Frankish tower that had built into the Propylaea were removed. And most of the Christian chapels in the caves on the slopes of the Acropolis were removed, along with a Muslim cemetery at the foot near the entrance.
Yeah, we haven't talked much about the slopes of the Acropolis. There's a lot of stuff there too, and maybe we'll revisit those at some point in the future.
Yeah. So the Acropolis itself is excavated right down to the bedrock. And one of the things this reveals, among other things, are the incredibly impressive foundations of the Parthenon. Underground, there are 22 courses of massive stone blocks supporting the Parthenon. And on the south side, which is the side that had to be built up more, the foundation is actually deeper than the Parthenon is tall.
Yeah, where the full 22 courses can be seen.
Yeah. But, of course, archaeology is still a fairly young discipline at this point. And so they're not really doing great archaeological work as they dig things up. So there's a lot of just like dirt that just gets dumped rather than sorted through and searched for artifacts and things that might tell us interesting things about the Acropolis history. Those dirt dumps are basically on the south side of the Acropolis. And they're still there, but they are under people's homes and buildings now. So yeah, there's a lot we probably lost.
They were probably full of quotidian day-to-day objects, little bits of pottery, tools, utensils, bone fragments, all sorts of stuff that archaeologists are now really, really deeply interested in.
Yeah.
Anyway, the modern archaeological service has inherited the 19th century rebuild of the ancient Acropolis. Since everything else has been stripped away, there's not much to do now other than to continue the work of restoring what's up there to the 5th century state as much as possible. In the Parthenon, this has involved rebuilding, disassembling, scanning, modeling, and repositioning all of the surviving blocks, cutting new pieces whenever necessary to actually fit a surviving fragment into its original context. So the goal is not to rebuild the whole building, it's to create a structure that repositions as much of the surviving original material as possible. It will always be a ruin, glorious but still a ruin. The Temple of Athena Nike has likewise gone through a bunch of rebuilds. It seems to have been disassembled by the Ottomans in the 17th century in connection with the Venetian siege of the city to be repurposed as fortifications. It's now been rebuilt a total of 3 times, and again, the goal has been to rebuild it in ways that do justice to the original structure. And I guess these efforts raise all sorts of questions about the ethics of archaeological site presentation. What is it we expect to see when we visit an archaeological site? And to what extent does the Acropolis adhere to those expectations?
I mean, it's challenging, right? Because do you say, okay, we want the site to represent this moment in time and to recreate that as best as possible? Or do you want the site to reflect all of the history that has happened there, in which case you get a site that doesn't look like it ever did at any point in time? I mean, I think those are the two big sort of competing ends, and I don't really know what the answer there is. I mean, in the case of the Acropolis, as you mentioned, a lot of those decisions were made before people were thinking about the ethics of archaeological site presentation. There's not so much we can do about that.
Right. Those decisions were driven by a very conscious desire to strip away anything that wasn't classically Greek and reflected a period of occupation, for lack of a better word. Yeah, it's a really tough problem. I mean, we have seen some interesting sites that do attempt to, present a monument in its sort of long context. right? So here I'm thinking of the Temple of Demeter we visited on Naxos, which is a temple which, like the Parthenon and the Erechtheion, was at some point converted into a church. And although when you visit it now, you're seeing mostly the classical temple, there has been a real effort to show you what modifications were made to the building in converting it into a church, and you can still see the foundations of some of those modifications and so on. So there are other ways, but it's a real challenge.
Yeah. And of course, none of this negates the fact that the Acropolis remains a striking symbol of Greece even today. And you can see it's important as a symbol in some stories that come out of World War II. So if you go to Greece today, you'll see on the Acropolis the Greek flag flying at the eastern end of the Acropolis. And there's a couple stories that come from the Nazi occupation of Greece. The first one here is apocryphal. We're not sure if it's true or not, but the story is that when the Germans show up, they demand that a soldier on the Acropolis take down the Greek flag and run up the Nazi swastika. And so the story goes, this young man functionally refuses. He takes down the Greek flag and then wraps himself in it and throws himself over the side of the Acropolis rather than put the Nazi swastika up. Now, like I said, the story might be apocryphal, but you can find a little plaque to this soldier on the slopes of the Acropolis. But a true story that did happen about a month or so after the Nazis occupied Athens, two college students managed to scale the Acropolis and take down the swastika. They then had to go into hiding and flee. They were tried by the Nazis in absentia and sentenced to death.
But never caught.
They were never caught. One of them, I think, just passed away a few years ago. So they survived the war, and there is also a plaque to them up as well near the Greek flag on the Acropolis. And so that was, of course, a huge risk. But I think it speaks to the importance of the Acropolis as a symbol to the modern state of Greece. You know, they didn't go elsewhere and take down other Nazi swastikas that were up. It was the one on the Acropolis that really was the symbolic insult to Greece and Greek identity in that moment. I find these stories incredibly moving, and I think it does speak to the fact that the Parthenon and the Acropolis throughout its long life has never lost its ability to impact the human soul. Like I said last time, it's unlike anything I've ever seen. It's one of the few things that pictures don't do it justice.
Agreed. Okay, I guess that gets us to the end of what we wanted to talk about today. We're going to do something a little bit different for our next couple of episodes.
Yeah, we're going to take a foray into what we might call classical reception. So we're going to think a little bit more about how things today interact with ideas from the past. In this case in particular, we're going to get into the idea of heroes. What is a hero in antiquity, but how does ancient ideas of a hero then come into modern storytelling and the hero's journey? And specifically, we're going to eventually get into some ideas I have about Stranger Things and how we can see parallels between 11 and Hercules.
So if you've never heard of Stranger Things, now's your chance to look it up and watch it before Emily talks about it and potentially spoils the ending of the whole series.
I'm not going to spoil the ending of the whole series because the 5th season won't have released yet.
Yes, I know.
We're just setting us up for to be ready for the 5th season.
Gotcha.
And I want to get it on record before the 5th season happens.
Gotcha.
Whether I'm right or wrong, you know. So that's all for us today. I'm Emily.
I'm Cam.
And this has been Have Toga Will Travel. Find us wherever you get your favorite podcasts or at havetogawilltravel.com. You can follow us on all the socials.
And if you like this episode, tell a friend about us. Thanks for listening, everybody.